She said it loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. You were just a pit stop, Mark. A training ground before I found the man I really deserved, and I swear the clink of glasses froze midair. The shuffle of shoes went silent, and the laughter around the office holiday party turned sharp, like a collective gasp dressed up as polite coughs. And there I stood with a cheap bourbon sweating in my palm, every eye turning my way while my wife, or I guess soon-to-be ex, angled herself closer to my boss, her red dress practically glowing under the dim bar lights of the copper rail, where the company had rented the upstairs lounge for the night. And it wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them, practiced, almost rehearsed, as if she wanted them carved into the memory of everyone there so I couldn't crawl out of it later with some excuse about things being misunderstood. No, she made sure humiliation had a witness list, as long as the client roster taped to the office whiteboard. And the worst part wasn't even the betrayal, it was the applause, the low chuckles from the men I used to grab beers with after work. Their wives or girlfriends biting back grins, and even the damn bartender smirked like he'd just watched a touchdown replayed on the big screen. And in that moment, I didn't yell, didn't throw the glass, didn't storm out. I just stood still, because sometimes the cruelest revenge begins in silence, in letting them think they've broken you when you're already tracing the cracks in their own glass house. And I'll get to that, but not before I introduce myself the right way, because you need to know whose shoes you're standing in right now. My name is Mark Holloway. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, where the winters cut into your bones like a truth you can't hide from. And I've been carrying the weight of ambition on my shoulders since I was old enough to shovel driveways for $5 and wonder if money could really buy peace. But before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and let me just drop one thing here that I won't explain yet. I had something they didn't know about, a quiet insurance policy, you might call it, hidden in plain sight, and it was the only reason I didn't crumble in that bar when my wife and my boss decided to write me off like a used-up training module because I had a way to turn their script against them. Though at the time, all anyone saw was a man with his pride bleeding out onto the sticky bar floor. I remember the smell of stale beer and peppermint schnapps mixing with pine-scented candles someone had lit in a half-hearted attempt to make the office party feel festive, and as I stood there, watching Rebecca. Yeah, that was her name. Rebecca. The woman I thought was my anchor rest her manicured hand on the arm of Jonathan Pierce, my boss. A man 10 years older with silver hair that he wore like a crown and a Rolex that screamed authority every time it caught the light. I felt this strange split inside me, like half of me was drowning while the other half was already sharpening knives in the dark corners of my mind. And if you've ever been publicly humiliated, you know what I mean? You smile, or at least you try to while your insides collapse. But somewhere in that collapse, you start drafting blueprints for something bigger than just licking your wounds. Rebecca laughed at something Jonathan whispered in her ear, her voice higher than usual, fake, too polished. And I thought about the first time we met in a college cafeteria, me eating cold pizza at 11 in the morning after pulling an all-nighter, her sliding into the seat across from me with that boldness she always carried. The kind that said she was testing the world to see if it would flinch. And I remember thinking, this is the kind of woman who would either build a kingdom with you or burn yours to the ground. And I guess now I had my answer. People avoid eye contact in moments like that, but not that night. They wanted to see me fall apart. Maybe because it made their own lives feel steadier, like watching a neighbor's house burn and thinking at least the flames aren't licking at your windows. And Jonathan, he thrived on that attention. I could see it in the way he straightened his tie, in how his shoulders squared. The man had always hated me. Not because I was incompetent, but because competence without worship makes men like him nervous. And if I'm being honest, Rebecca choosing him wasn't just about the money or the title. It was about punishing me for not bowing enough, for not feeding her ego the way she craved. And that's when one of those little truths hit me, the kind you want to write down and tape to a mirror. Betrayal doesn't always come from hate. Sometimes it comes from hunger, and when someone's hungry for validation, they'll eat the hand that feeds them. I should have left. I should have walked down the stairs, pushed through the icy air outside, driven home, but pride is a stubborn thing, and I wasn't going to let them see me retreat. So I stood there, sipping the warm bourbon like it was water, telling myself over and over, you've got a card they can't play, and I watched the night unravel like a slow-motion train wreck. Coworkers slapping Jonathan on the back, women leaning in to whisper to Rebecca, their faces painted with curiosity and envy, and someone even muttered, guess she traded up, which felt like a knife pressed against my ribs, but I smiled. I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt, because there's nothing more unnerving to traders than the silence of the man they just tried to bury. I thought about calling my brother Chris, the only person who would have told me to keep my head high, but he was 2 states away with his own kids and his own mess. And besides, this was mine to carry, mine to turn into something else. And as the night wound down, as people staggered out into the parking lot, pulling coats tighter around themselves against the Ohio wind, Rebecca never once looked back at me, not even a glance, as if I'd been erased already, and Jonathan gave me a little nod. The kind bosses give to interns when they've done something adequate, and I wanted to laugh, because that nod told me everything. It told me he thought the war was over, that I'd already lost, and I don't think I've ever felt more alive than in that realization, because I knew something they didn't. Wars aren't decided in bars, they're decided in silence, in the quiet places where planning feels like prayer. On the drive home, the roads slick with half-frozen slush, I replayed it all. Every word, every glance, and somewhere between a red light and the hum of the defroster, I realized another truth worth carrying. Loyalty is invisible until it breaks, and when it breaks, it cuts deeper than any blade, but the cut teaches you where to build armor. I pulled into my driveway. The Christmas lights Rebecca had insisted on still glowing against the siding, cheerful and hollow. And when I walked inside, the smell of cinnamon-scented candles hit me, the same kind she used to light when we wanted to make the house feel like a home, and for the first time it smelled like smoke instead of warmth. I grabbed a mug, poured myself black coffee, even though it was near midnight, because coffee was always my reset button, my ritual when the world tilted sideways, and as I sat there, staring at the steam rising, I thought about my father's old words. Don't fight a fire with water if you can suffocate it with smoke. And that's when the plan began to take shape. A plan that would use not fists or shouting, but patience, paperwork, and the one symbolic thing Rebecca had always underestimated: coffee mugs, those cheap ceramic things we collected from every trip, every conference, every stop on the road of our lives together. And it's funny because she used to say, "Why do you keep these?" They're worthless, but one day she'd learned that the worthless things are sometimes the sharpest weapons. When I woke up the next morning, the house felt colder than the snow pressed against the windows, and I realized it wasn't the thermostat, it was the silence, the kind that comes not from peace but from absence, from someone moving through your space with the deliberate distance of a stranger. And Rebecca was in the kitchen wearing that satin robe I'd bought her last Christmas, humming while she scrolled through her phone, her coffee already poured into her favorite travel mug, the one with the gold rim that said "Boss Lady" in looping letters. A gift I'd given her half as a joke and half as encouragement, but now it felt like an insult sitting on the counter, a neon sign pointing to everything I wasn't, and I almost asked her if she'd enjoyed last night, if it felt good to publicly gut me like a deer in front of the whole damn office, but I bit my tongue because men like Jonathan and women like Rebecca feed off confrontation. They grow stronger when they see you scrambling for explanations, so instead I poured my own coffee into an old chipped Ohio State mug, the one I'd kept since college, and I made sure to set it down on the counter with a thud, just loud enough for her to glance up, her eyes flicking over me like she was cataloging a piece of furniture she might sell on Craigslist. And I thought, this is how betrayal looks in daylight. It's not fiery, it's not dramatic, it's mundane, it's someone scrolling their phone like you don't even exist. She said she had to leave early, some errand before work, and I knew better than to ask what it was, because the truth was already there in the way she tightened the belt of that robe, in the way she reached for her car keys with a smile that wasn't for me. And as she walked out, her perfume trailing behind her, I sat back down, cupping the hot mug in my hands like it was the last steady thing in my life. And I thought, if humiliation was the shot fired, then today was the echo. And the echo always tells you how far the bullet traveled. When I got to the office, the whispers were already there, buzzing in the hallways like fluorescent lights you can't shut off, and I could feel the shift in the way people looked at me, not pity, not really, more like amusement, like they'd been let in on a private joke that I was too slow to catch, and Jonathan was standing by the glass wall of his office, hands in his pockets, his voice carrying just enough that I could hear him chuckle at something Rebecca texted him, and I swear I could almost see the glow of her name reflected on his phone screen. That's when I understood the game wasn't just about her choosing him, it was about them flaunting it, using it as a weapon to push me down a notch, to remind me who held the cards in this company. And I had to admit, it was smart, in a cruel sort of way, because nothing destabilizes a man in corporate America faster than making him look like a fool, like his personal life is a punchline. And in that world, perception is currency. But what Jonathan didn't know, what Rebecca had forgotten, was that I'd been quietly stockpiling a different kind of currency for years. Not just in savings accounts or side hustles, but in the details, the little overlooked things, the receipts, the agreements, the fine print that everyone else is too arrogant to read. And I knew one day that would matter. But for now, I had to play the role they'd written for me, the discarded husband, the humiliated employee, and there's a strange kind of freedom in that because when people think you're broken, they stop watching for the ways you're piecing yourself back together. At lunch, I sat alone in the cafeteria, poking at a sandwich I didn't want, and a younger guy from accounting, fresh out of college with his tie crooked, leaned over and said, "Hey man, sorry about, and he trailed off because he didn't actually know what to say, and I almost laughed, because isn't that the truth of betrayal? No one knows how to address it, so they either whisper or pretend it didn't happen, and in both cases, you're left holding the silence. I told him not to worry about it, cracked a joke about how at least my weekends were free now, and he laughed a little too hard, relieved, but inside I was grinding because humor is armor. Sure, but armor still means you're preparing for a fight. That afternoon, Jonathan called me into his office, his tone dripping with false casualness, and he gestured toward the leather chair across from his desk like he was doing me some kind of favor, and then he leaned back, fingers steepled, and said, "Look, Mark, I think we both know the energy's shifted around here, and I want to make sure we can keep things professional, no matter what happens outside these walls." And I nodded, kept my expression neutral, but inside I was cataloging every word, every smirk, because I knew this wasn't just a conversation, it was the opening statement of a man who thought he'd already won the case. When I got home that night, Rebecca was already there, her heels kicked off by the door, a half-empty glass of wine on the counter, and she didn't even flinch when I walked in, just kept scrolling her phone, her thumb moving fast, her smile small and private, and I wanted to ask if it was Jonathan on the other end. But instead I just hung my coat, poured myself coffee, even though it was almost 10 at night, and sat down across from her, the steam rising between us like a wall. She finally looked up, her eyes glazed with wine, and said, "Don't look at me like that, Mark. You've always been so damn judgmental, like you were grading me on some invisible scale." And I shook my head because that wasn't true, not really. But she needed it to be true so she could justify what she was doing, and I realized then that betrayal always comes with its own script, its own built-in excuses, and the hardest part is knowing they actually believe them. She went upstairs without another word, the sound of her footsteps fading, and I sat there long after the coffee went cold, staring at the mug in my hand, the chipped handle digging into my palm. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment where a man either lets himself rot in bitterness or starts charting a different course, and I wasn't going to rot. That weekend, I drove out past the city limits, where the strip malls give way to empty fields and old diners with cracked signs, and I sat in a booth at one of them with a notebook, the kind I used to keep in college, and I started writing not poetry, not some sad journal entries, but steps, calculations, a blueprint for how to turn their arrogance into a weapon against them. And with every line I wrote, I felt the humiliation of that night at the copper rail shrink into something else, something sharper, something I could wield. And maybe that sounds dramatic, but you have to understand when your whole world implodes in front of an audience, you don't get to rebuild it the same way. You have to forge it into something new, and that's when I wrote down another truth. Revenge isn't about getting even, it's about making sure the people who underestimated you learn to measure twice before they cut again. The weeks that followed were like walking barefoot across broken glass. Every step painful. Every day a reminder that the life I thought I had was nothing but a stage play where I'd been written out of the final act. And Rebecca didn't even bother hiding it anymore. She stayed out late and came home with excuses that sounded like they'd been copied and pasted from some bad TV script. Drinks with the girls. Late project meeting. Traffic was awful. And maybe she thought I'd rage, that I'd confront her, that I'd crumble in some melodramatic display that would justify her betrayal. But I didn't. I just let her stack her lies like firewood. Because I knew one day soon she'd be standing in front of the blaze without realizing I was the one holding the match. At the office, Jonathan grew louder, more smug. His little comments disguised as jokes, like asking if I needed a wingman on Tinder during a meeting or reminding the whole team during a presentation that sometimes old partnerships just don't pan out. And people laughed nervously, because in corporate America, you laugh when the man with the title laughs. But I could see the cracks, the subtle shifts in eyes around the table, because if there's one thing people secretly hate, it's arrogance served with a smirk, and Jonathan was serving it by the plateful. I kept my head down, nodded when I needed to, delivered work sharper than ever, because there's something almost intoxicating about weaponizing competence, about being so undeniably good that they can't quite fire you without raising questions. And I knew Jonathan wanted me gone, but firing me would mean facing HR, facing legal, facing the board. And that's where my hidden advantage began to quietly hum in the background like a loaded gun under the table. At home, the coffee mugs piled up in the sink, each one a small marker of another day survived, another night endured, and sometimes I'd catch Rebecca rinsing out that boss lady mug, smiling to herself as if the words were a crown she'd stolen, and I'd want to laugh, because she had no idea that crown was made of tin, that the world she was stepping into wasn't built for her. It was built to use her, and Jonathan he'd chew her up the way he chewed through everything else, clients, employees, ex-wives, and by the time she realized it, it would be too late. I started keeping track of little things. Text times, receipts she left in the trash, the way Jonathan suddenly blocked off his afternoons with personal meetings. And it wasn't out of jealousy, not anymore. It was data, raw information, and if I learned anything in my 38 years, it's this. Information is the only real currency that holds value no matter how markets crash or people betray you. I didn't tell anyone, not Chris, not the guys from the gym, not even my barber who'd always been good for listening to my problems when I sat in his chair, because this was a one-man war, and wars are won in silence before the first shot ever fires. One Friday night, Rebecca came home drunk. Not sloppy, but just enough to loosen her tongue, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table, wine glass in hand, and said, "You know what your problem is, Mark? You never made me feel like the most important person in the room. You were always so focused on your work, your routines, your damn coffee mugs, like I was competing with your ambition for attention." I just stared at her, let the words hang there, because the irony almost choked me. This was coming from the woman who chose to humiliate me in front of my entire office, who was now draping herself over my boss for validation, and she wanted to call me judgmental. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so sad. But instead of arguing, I just said, "Maybe you're right." And her eyes flickered because she wanted a fight, she wanted fuel to justify what she was doing, and I wasn't going to give it to her. She stumbled upstairs, and I sat there a long time after, drinking black coffee out of the Ohio State mug. And I thought, people betray you because they think you won't change. They think they've mapped you out. But the moment you step outside their map, they're lost. And nothing terrifies a betrayer more than realizing they no longer know who they're dealing with. At work, Jonathan tried to pull a stunt assigning me to a dead-end project. Some busy work that he thought would keep me sidelined, but what he didn't realize was that I'd been keeping my own private files. Backups of contracts, email trails, little overlooked details that tied back to deals he'd cut corners on, expenses he'd padded, timesheets that didn't add up, and while he smirked in meetings, I was quietly stitching together a net strong enough to strangle him if I chose to pull it tight. And here's the thing, I didn't even need to use it yet. The knowledge alone was enough to steady me, enough to keep me from breaking when Rebecca flaunted her late nights or Jonathan dropped another smug line. Because every time they tried to humiliate me, I reminded myself, you've already got the blade, and they don't even know they're bleeding. One night, I drove out to a quiet overlook outside Columbus, the kind of place where you can see the city lights spread out like a blanket of stars. And I sat there in my truck with the radio low, sipping coffee from a thermos, and I let myself feel it all. The anger, the loss, the betrayal, but then I let it harden into something sharper, something calmer, because anger is fire, but revenge is ice, and ice lasts longer. I thought about my father again, about the way he used to warn me that pride was the most expensive thing a man could own, because it costs you friends, family, sometimes even your sanity. And I realized then that I wasn't fighting for pride, not really, I was fighting for balance, for the kind of justice that doesn't come from shouting matches or fists thrown in bars, but from letting people trip over the very rope they tied around your neck. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't just survive this. I'd make sure when they told the story years later, no one would remember the humiliation at the copper rail. They'd only remember how it ended. How the man they thought was finished walked out with scars. Sure, but with a quiet kind of victory that left them ruined. It started small, almost invisible, like the first cracks in a windshield you only notice when the sun hits it just right. Jonathan and Rebecca letting their new relationship bleed into the workplace in subtle ways. A shared laugh that lasted too long. Her showing up with a box of pastries on a Monday morning and leaving one on his desk with a wink while the rest of the office pretended not to notice. And every gesture was another reminder that they thought they'd broken me, that I was just another discarded man they could use as a cautionary tale. But what they didn't realize was that every smirk, every breadcrumb they left behind was fuel for the fire I was quietly building, and I had already started laying down the framework to ensure that when it burned, it wouldn't just singe them, it would consume everything they'd built together. Jonathan called me into his office one afternoon, leaned back in his chair with that smugness he wore like cologne, and said, "Listen, Mark, I know things are complicated, but I think we need to start thinking about your future here, maybe a step back from some of the bigger accounts, something more manageable." And the way he let that word hang in the air like I was a wounded animal he was being merciful enough to put down gently made my jaw ache from clenching. But I forced a smile and said, "Whatever's best for the team, Jonathan, because sometimes the sharpest blade is patience." And I already knew the one thing he didn't. The contracts he was so eager to shuffle off to himself were riddled with discrepancies. Little mistakes no one had caught yet, but I had them printed, time-stamped, backed up in places he couldn't erase even if he tried, and all I had to do was wait. Rebecca grew bolder too, coming home later and later, sometimes not even bothering to make excuses, and once, when she stumbled in close to midnight smelling of Jonathan's cologne, she laughed when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, and she said, "You're pathetic, Mark. Sitting here like some sad old man with your stupid mugs while the rest of us are actually living." And I didn't flinch, didn't rise. I just sipped my coffee and thought, "Keep talking. Every word you throw at me is another brick in the wall you'll crash into." At work, I started noticing little resentments building around Jonathan. People tired of his arrogance, of the way he played favorites with Rebecca, of the smirks and the digs. And though they laughed in meetings, I could see it in their eyes. They were waiting for someone to check him, and that's when I realized I didn't have to fight this war alone. I just had to nudge the pieces into place and let his own weight do the rest. One afternoon, I accidentally left a file open on the shared drive. Nothing incriminating, just enough to hint that Jonathan had been double-expensing client dinners. And within a day, the whispers started, soft at first, then louder because gossip in an office spreads faster than any fire, and I made sure to keep my hands clean, to look surprised when people mentioned it, to shake my head as if I couldn't believe such a thing. And all the while Jonathan strutted around oblivious, because arrogance is blind. It convinces you no one could possibly be watching close enough to catch you. Rebecca, meanwhile, leaned into her new role, showing up at company events on Jonathan's arm as if she'd earned it, smiling like she'd won. And I almost felt sorry for her, because I knew how temporary it was, how Jonathan's track record with women was a trail of wreckage, and she was just the latest passenger on his sinking ship. But pity is wasted on betrayers. So instead I focused on the details, the bank statements, the credit card bills, the receipts she tossed in the trash without thinking, and I collected them like a hunter-gatherer's tracks, each one leading closer to the trap I was setting. At night, I found myself driving the same stretch of highway out past the city, the hum of the tires against the pavement steadying me, the thermos of coffee at my side like a lifeline, and I'd think about how strange life is, how the things you think are weaknesses, habits, rituals, even something as small as a chipped college muck, and become anchors when the storm hits. And I wrote another truth into my notebook one of those nights. Strength isn't about never being broken, it's about knowing how to use the pieces once you are. One Saturday morning, Chris called me, my brother, his voice full of concern because word had reached him somehow, and he said, "Mark, you can't let them walk all over you like this. Man, you've worked too damn hard." And I told him I was fine, that I was handling it. And he didn't push, but I could hear it in his voice. He didn't believe me, and maybe I didn't even believe me yet. But I knew I would, because the plan was already bigger than survival. It was about flipping the entire board, about making sure when the dust settled, they'd be the ones explaining themselves in whispers while I sipped my coffee in peace. And maybe it sounds petty, maybe it sounds small, but you don't know betrayal until you've lived it, until you've been humiliated so thoroughly that your very name feels like it's become a punchline, and when that happens, revenge stops being optional, it becomes oxygen. Jonathan's arrogance hit a new peak the following week, like a wave that's been building unseen under the surface, and he decided it was time to cut me out of the most lucrative accounts to make it look like a strategic reassignment, while everyone nodded along, pretending they didn't notice that I was being boxed into a corner. And when he called me into his office, his tone falsely casual, he said, "Mark, I think it's time you focus on the smaller clients for a bit. Make sure they're stable before handling the big accounts again. We wouldn't want a mistake at this stage." And I kept my expression neutral, nodding like a man accepting a generous offer, while inside I was cataloging every email, every attachment, every time-stamped note that proved just how sloppy his oversight had been. And I smiled quietly to myself, because in arrogance, Jonathan had forgotten one truth I'd known since college. The bigger they act, the harder they fall when someone else reads the fine print. At home, Rebecca had taken to leaving her laptop open on the kitchen counter, her emails sometimes slipping just enough for me to catch the trail of her planning lunches with Jonathan, casual fun nights, even discussing vacations she hadn't told me about, and every glance I stole at her screen felt like unearthing another brick in the wall of evidence I was quietly building. Evidence that would one day turn their hubris against them, and I kept reminding myself with a small, bitter smile that the details, the minutiae, are the weapons no one sees coming until it's too late. The office itself began to feel like a minefield. Every meeting, every casual comment, every passing glance loaded with double meanings, but I learned to navigate it with the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to gain, because the humiliation at the copper rail had stripped me of the illusion that appearances mattered, leaving me with clarity that people like Jonathan underestimate at their peril, and I used that clarity to my advantage, asking precise questions in meetings, leaving voicemails I never sent, sending emails to myself with copies of important communications so that nothing could be disputed later, and I watched quietly as he tried to play the alpha, strutting around with Rebecca at his side, thinking his smirk was enough to keep the office in line, when in reality he was a man building a house of cards on a slope, and I had the gentle push that would bring it all down. At night, I'd sit in my truck before heading inside, thermos of coffee in hand, and I'd run through scenarios in my head, like a general mapping battle lines, rehearsing what needed to happen and when, and that's when I realized how calm betrayal can make you when you understand the power of preparation. While they were celebrating small victories, I was already plotting the true game. Rebecca's boldness grew almost daily. She would leave me messages dripping with smugness, sometimes even sending screenshots from Jonathan's phone as if to prove her conquest, and it stung like acid. But every message also added to my pile, a quiet dossier of arrogance and indiscretion that would one day be lethal. I remembered my father's words again. Mark, never underestimate the man who keeps his receipts. And I realized that wasn't just practical advice, it was philosophy, a way to turn the chaos of betrayal into order. And I started cataloging everything, her texts, her credit card statements, her hotel bookings, Jonathan's misfiled expense reports. Even the little things like the way he bragged about mentoring her in front of clients, all of it logged, time-stamped, cross-referenced, a bureaucratic net growing invisible in plain sight. And the strangest thing about that work was the thrill. People who humiliate you assume you're broken, assume your spark is gone, but when you turn that fire into meticulous, quiet calculation, it becomes something sharper, something that hums beneath the surface like a living thing. One morning, Jonathan tried to push harder, calling a meeting with me, HR, and 2 other managers, clearly intending to corner me, to make a case for reassigning me permanently to small accounts. And he had this smug look on his face, like he'd rehearsed it, like it was a chess move that couldn't be countered. But I had anticipated it, quietly forwarding copies of critical communications to HR and to my own secure email before the meeting. Emails that documented his errors, discrepancies, and questionable approvals. And when he opened his mouth to accuse me of being a risk to the company, HR interrupted, calm and precise, asking for clarifications I'd already provided in writing. And I watched the color drain from Jonathan's face as one small overlooked detail, the date of an expense report he'd approved without cross-verifying, became the wedge HR needed to pause the discussion, to scrutinize him, and I almost laughed because the man thought the office was his stage, unaware that he was stepping into a trap he had built himself. And I sat there, sipping my coffee, the warmth of the mug in my hand grounding me, thinking, sometimes procedural justice is the deadliest kind, because it hides behind rules while cutting through pride. At home, Rebecca didn't notice the subtle shift yet. She still leaned into her triumph, leaving lipstick stains on the wine glasses I washed alone, wearing Jonathan's cologne sometimes, humming while she scrolled her phone, and I kept my distance, pretending to be the quiet, humiliated man she assumed I'd become. But in truth, every detail she revealed was ammunition. Every careless gesture a nail in the coffin she didn't even know she was building, and I kept reminding myself that vengeance is not a sprint. It's a patient, deliberate march, and each step, each document, each minor victory that no one notices, adds to the eventual reckoning. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had quietly lined up the first part of my plan, an email trail that would make Jonathan squirm, receipts and credit card statements that would make Rebecca falter, and a symbolic detail she'd never guess her own coffee mug, the one she mocked, would be part of the first real taste of consequences, a poetic reminder that small things, ignored and undervalued, often have the sharpest edges. The following week, the office felt like a pressure cooker. Jonathan pacing like a general who thought he'd won a war. Rebecca appearing in the break room with that infuriating smile as she recounted a lunch with him to colleagues, and me, Mark, sitting quietly at my desk, sipping coffee from my chipped Ohio State mug, as if I hadn't noticed, letting their arrogance roll over me like waves, while beneath that calm surface, the gears of my plan clicked into place. Each detail lining up like dominoes waiting for the slightest nudge, and I began to test the edges, small maneuvers that seemed innocent to everyone else, but carried consequences they couldn't see. A misfiled contract redirected just so, an innocuous email forgotten in the archive. Receipts left in folders where Jonathan would stumble upon them when checking for compliance. All small things, but enough to start eroding their confidence without them realizing it. Because people who betray others rarely consider that the very same hubris they flaunt can be weaponized against them. That morning, Rebecca had the audacity to waltz past my desk, wearing the red dress from the office holiday party, laughing at a joke Jonathan whispered in her ear, and I felt a flare of something hot, something sharp, but instead of confronting her, I simply sent a draft email to HR, highlighting an oversight in a project Jonathan had been managing, and I watched, barely suppressing a smirk, as he walked past my office later that day with a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the first ripple of a storm he hadn't noticed forming quietly under the surface. At home, Rebecca had taken to leaving Jonathan's belongings around, a casual claiming of territory that made it clear she thought she'd won, that I was already written out of our shared narrative, and one evening, as she hummed in the kitchen while preparing a salad, I caught sight of her boss lady mug perched on the counter next to Jonathan's half-drunk coffee, and I thought, the same mug she mocked months ago would mark her first lesson in the consequences of arrogance, that small objects, underestimated, could carry weight far beyond what she imagined, and I made a mental note to integrate it into the eventual reckoning. I reminded myself that revenge, like patience, is often invisible, and the best kind is the one that creeps up quietly until the betrayers are stepping into it of their own accord. That night, I drove past the city lights again, coffee steaming in a thermos, hands wrapped around the warmth, rehearsing the next moves, nudging Jonathan into scrutiny without him noticing, letting Rebecca's casual bragging create a record she couldn't erase, and ensuring that when the first domino fell, it would be irreversible. And as I drove, I realized the strangest thing about betrayal. The people who humiliate you assume you will crack, that your pride will fracture into something small and bitter, but when you do nothing but prepare in silence, when you let them display their arrogance unchecked, that assumption becomes the seed of their undoing. One day, a minor discrepancy I'd quietly set in motion caused a client to question Jonathan's report, a trivial detail overlooked that normally would have been buried, but the client's persistence forced a chain reaction. Jonathan was pulled into meetings, explanations, and follow-ups that began to erode his confidence, and I watched from my desk, pretending to type, pretending to be occupied, while inside, I felt the first taste of satisfaction that comes from knowing someone is finally feeling the unease they've inflicted on you. And I reminded myself to stay calm because patience was part of the architecture of my revenge, and every small ripple now would accumulate into a wave that would eventually wash them away. Meanwhile, Rebecca had started leaving messages on my phone, little taunts designed to make me question my sanity, calling late at night with giggles and whispers, and I let them ring, let them hang in my mind, because her carelessness was a mirror of Jonathan's, a reflection of the same arrogance that would be their undoing, and each careless gesture, each smirk, each casual flaunt of their triumph was another brick in the cage I was quietly building around them. Late one evening, I found myself in the empty office, the hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet smell of leftover coffee grounding me, and I began reviewing everything: emails, contracts, receipts, project notes, even casual Slack messages, looking for patterns, for leverage, for the small oversights that people blinded by pride inevitably leave behind, and I realized, almost with a shiver, that this quiet attention to detail, this obsessive documentation, was a kind of art form, a way to sculpt consequences out of chaos, and I was becoming a master, while they remained blind to it, playing at victory on a stage they thought they controlled. That night, I poured myself a cup of coffee, staring into the steam rising from the mug, and thought about all the things I'd learned in the past weeks. Betrayal is a teacher disguised as pain. Arrogance is the easiest weapon to turn. And sometimes the smallest things, like a chipped mug, a misfiled email, a forgotten receipt, carry the weight of justice when wielded correctly. And I reminded myself that the plan was still unfolding, that the storm was coming, but it would be silent. It would be precise. And it would leave no doubt about who had underestimated whom. By the weekend, the first tremors of their unraveling were evident. Jonathan appeared slightly more cautious in meetings, his smirk faltering when I referenced a report he had submitted. Rebecca's bragging became punctuated with small slips, little mentions she didn't think would matter, and I catalogued it all, quietly savoring the way their confidence, so carefully built, began to erode, because nothing is more satisfying than watching someone drown in the hubris they thought was invincible, and I kept reminding myself, quietly, that revenge is not about spectacle, it's about inevitability, and when it arrives, it should feel like destiny, not a hand reaching down from some higher place, and with each coffee sip, each careful calculation, each unnoticed correction, I was shaping that destiny, and I could feel it in my bones. The first wave of reckoning was almost ready to roll. By the time Monday rolled around, the air in the office had changed in ways almost imperceptible but deadly, like the moment before a storm when even the birds stop singing. And I could see it in Jonathan's posture, the twitch in his fingers as he flipped through reports, the way he glanced at me out of the corner of his eye, trying to gauge whether I'd noticed the subtle shift that had begun to take place, and I had every detail, every missed line, every misfiled contract I'd carefully set in motion for months, and I smiled quietly, sipping my coffee, knowing that the first dominoes were falling, imperceptible at first but building toward something unstoppable. While Rebecca strutted through the office hallways with her heels clicking against the polished floors, phone in hand, bragging to anyone who would listen about lunches, gifts, and secret jokes with Jonathan, oblivious to the fact that each word she flaunted was already a trap, a thread in the net that would soon tighten around them, and I thought, sipping my chipped Ohio State mug, that people who humiliate others rarely consider that their own arrogance can be weaponized against them, that every careless gesture and every smug laugh can be catalogued, cross-referenced, and stored until the moment of reckoning arrives. The first real blow came subtly, almost accidentally in appearance. A client called, confused about charges on their account, something Jonathan had approved weeks ago without cross-checking, a tiny discrepancy that in normal circumstances would have been shrugged off, but I had prepared it, forwarded the supporting documentation to HR, to the finance team, and even CC'd myself to preserve a record. And suddenly Jonathan was on the defensive, explaining, clarifying, fumbling over details he didn't remember submitting, and I sat at my desk pretending to type, pretending to be busy, watching the unraveling like a hawk circling prey, and I could feel a thrill in the quiet mastery of it, because revenge, when constructed carefully, is far more satisfying than immediate gratification. Rebecca, meanwhile, had started leaving evidence of her overconfidence in plain sight. Receipts for expensive dinners, hotel bookings, a casual mention to a colleague about a weekend trip, and I gathered each one like a meticulous collector, a silent archivist, building a dossier that would turn her own carelessness into the linchpin of their undoing. Every day I reminded myself of two things. First, patience is sharper than anger, and second, people always reveal their own weakness when they believe they are untouchable. One evening, I stayed late. The office empty except for the hum of the Havik system and the occasional distant sound of a janitor's vacuum, and I went through everything again, line by line. Jonathan's approvals, his expense reports, emails he'd sent in haste, Rebecca's own notes that she thought I'd never see, and I realized that all these tiny errors and careless admissions, catalogued over months, were becoming a mosaic. A precise pattern of arrogance and oversight that would leave them exposed if used correctly, and I smiled at the thought, the calm of revenge filling me with focus instead of rage. I made small adjustments to the trap, leaving intentional gaps that would lure Jonathan into overconfidence, ensuring that every move he made in the coming days would push him closer to collapse, while Rebecca's indulgences at home, her careless flaunting of her triumph, would provide the emotional fuel for the inevitable fallout. There was a strange poetry to it, sipping my black coffee, staring at the lines of text on the screen, knowing that the very things they believed would protect them were the exact things that would doom them, and I felt a rare clarity. The storm was coming, and it would feel as if it were fate, though every gust, every drop, Every strike had been measured and placed by me. The next morning, Jonathan's first misstep played out almost theatrically. A meeting with a client went wrong because of a minor miscommunication I had subtly amplified through a carefully worded email sent the day before. Something no one else would notice until the impact was felt, and I watched from my desk as the client questioned him directly, their tone polite but firm, leaving Jonathan flustered and off balance, fumbling to maintain control, his arrogance slipping just enough to crack the veneer of dominance he so carefully maintained. And I felt a quiet satisfaction as I took a slow sip of coffee, thinking, the bigger they act, the more precise the fall must be, and this was only the beginning. Rebecca, unaware of the ripples she was creating, sent a casual message to a coworker bragging about a weekend getaway with Jonathan, and I saved it, timestamped, and archived it in my private folder, knowing that her own hubris would soon be leveraged as proof of impropriety and overreach, and the thought made my chest tighten with the intoxicating weight of quiet control. At home that evening, she returned late again, smiling, dangling keys like a trophy, confident that she had won, and I stood by the counter, black coffee in hand, letting her parade her triumph, watching her gestures, observing the little cues that revealed overconfidence, that hinted at vulnerability, and I reminded myself, the best revenge is the one they never see coming until it's too late. She laughed at some imagined slight from me, and I nodded absently, keeping my face neutral, and every laugh, every boast, every careless smile became part of the trap, a thread connecting to Jonathan's crumbling facade at the office, and together they were weaving the noose I had spent months constructing. I thought about the chipped mug in my hand, the one I'd carried since college, and realized it was more than a ritual. It was a symbol, a constant reminder that the smallest, most overlooked objects and habits often outlast arrogance and deceit, and one day it would mark the moment they finally understood how thoroughly they had underestimated me. By the weekend, subtle consequences multiplied. Jonathan had to answer detailed questions from the finance team about approvals. Rebecca's bragging started reaching ears it shouldn't have, and I stayed calm, collecting every piece, cataloging every slip, quietly nudging them toward exposure without ever breaking my composure. And with every passing day, I felt the pulse of inevitability grow stronger, like a tide slowly eroding cliffs, unstoppable once it reached a critical point. And in that quiet, methodical, almost clinical patience, I realized something vital. Revenge is never about hasty bursts of anger. It is the architecture of inevitability, the accumulation of minor truths that, when revealed at the right time, shatter arrogance and expose betrayal in its purest form. And I, Mark Holloway, 38, from Columbus, Ohio, had already begun constructing that architecture, one coffee sip, one archived email, one unnoticed slip at a time. By midweek, the office had taken on a different rhythm, a quiet tension that wasn't visible at first glance but saturated the air like static before a thunderstorm. And I could feel it in every step Jonathan took, in every glance Rebecca threw across the hall, both of them unaware that each small move was another stitch in the net that would eventually hold them completely exposed. Jonathan started double-checking his own reports, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw, his hands fidgeting as he shuffled papers, and I watched it all with that slow, deliberate patience that makes betrayal taste sweeter than anger ever could, sipping my coffee from the chipped Ohio State mug like a ritual, like an anchor to the quiet fury of planning, knowing that while they saw only chaos, I saw the inevitability of collapse, the architecture of revenge finally solidifying. At home, Rebecca had begun leaving subtle signs of their triumph too obvious. Her texts accidentally sent to me instead of a coworker, her social media posts full of smugness about dinners, dates, trips, and I saved each one, time-stamped and filed, and I began to notice the patterns, the way arrogance creates footprints, a trail of breadcrumbs that only someone paying attention could follow to the source. And one, Mark Holloway, had been watching all along, waiting for the moment where the culmination of carelessness and pride would intersect perfectly with my carefully hidden advantage. I started nudging Jonathan more aggressively, though still under the guise of cooperation, casually asking for clarifications in meetings, leaving emails flagged with minor but undeniable discrepancies, and letting the finance team overhear small contradictions in his statements. The first seeds of panic were visible in his posture, the way he avoided eye contact, the tiny cracks in his voice as he defended decisions I had already documented, each one feeding the subtle chaos I had orchestrated for months. and I could feel that faint thrill in my chest that comes when someone who humiliated you is finally beginning to squirm under the weight of their own hubris. All while I remained calm, collected, coffee in hand, a silent observer of the storm I had engineered. Rebecca, oblivious, continued her public flaunting, and I found myself noting the symmetry and the symbolism. Her boss lady mug, the one she had mocked months ago, always sitting carelessly on her desk when she was with Jonathan, a perfect marker for when the time came to tie her indulgence to consequence, to use the very object she had scorned as a thread in the web of poetic justice. At home, I began subtle manipulations of routine, leaving minor hints of awareness, questions about receipts, casual mentions of misfiled emails, all designed to unnerve without confrontation, and I could see the anxiety beginning to ripple through Rebecca's bravado, her confident facade slipping slightly, the first tiny cracks of doubt, while Jonathan, at work, began second-guessing decisions, the first moments of hesitation marking a slow erosion of his usual dominance. And I reminded myself that the most devastating part of revenge is often psychological. The way it gnaws at the betrayer before the physical consequences even arrive, that the mind bends first, then the world follows. One afternoon, I executed the next phase. A carefully timed email to HR highlighting Jonathan's repeated approval oversights, coupled with a subtle note to the compliance officer about expense irregularities, all tied to previously documented errors. And I watched the reaction unfold almost like a scene in a film. Jonathan's face drained, the air in the room shifted, colleagues whispered, and I, the quiet architect of it all, sat at my desk pretending to organize files, savoring the precise, bureaucratic unraveling of a man who had once thought he could humiliate me with impunity. Rebecca, meanwhile, had left her phone on the counter, notifications visible, a text from Jonathan about a weekend getaway, and I made sure to capture it, a time-stamped record that linked them directly in a pattern of carelessness, a thread I could pull at the perfect moment to demonstrate hubris and entitlement. And I knew in my gut that this small, almost invisible maneuver was a prelude to a much larger collapse. The first hints of poetic justice taking shape quietly in the shadows. At night, I drove past the city lights again, thermos of coffee in hand, reflecting on the orchestration of events, the way minor actions amplified under the weight of attention, and the cruel satisfaction of seeing arrogance topple under its own weight. And I wrote in my notebook, in the small, precise handwriting I had cultivated over weeks of preparation, people reveal themselves in the smallest things. Arrogance leaves fingerprints that no one cares to notice until it's too late, and I knew that the culmination of these tiny invisible details would lead to an outcome so precise and inescapable that both Jonathan and Rebecca would finally understand the cost of underestimating me. The chipped mug sat on the counter, a constant reminder, a symbolic anchor, a ritual element that connected the months of careful observation to the eventual reckoning, and I realized that part of the satisfaction of revenge is not only the collapse itself, but the poetic symbolism that transforms mundane objects and routines into instruments of justice. By the weekend, I had orchestrated subtle consequences that rippled through both Jonathan and Rebecca's lives. Jonathan's confidence was visibly shaken in client meetings. Rebecca's smug texts and social media posts had already become documentation of carelessness and entitlement, and I had begun setting up the final threads, tying together office documentation with personal indiscretions, creating a lattice of inevitability, a carefully structured web where the moment of collapse would arrive not as a surprise to me, but as an unmasking of every arrogance-fueled choice they had made. And I sipped my coffee one last time before shutting down my laptop, the warmth grounding me, thinking, revenge is architecture, and I, Mark Holloway, had designed the blueprint, down to the chipped mug, the misfiled email, and the careless brag, all waiting for the precise moment when the weight of inevitability would crush them together. By the following Monday, the tension had become almost tangible, a low hum in the office that made every step feel heavier, every glance sharper, and Jonathan, once the picture of confidence, now walked with a calculated caution that betrayed his unease. Every interaction laced with microsecond hesitations as he tried to navigate the small landmines I had laid out in plain sight, but masked as innocuous details, and I, Mark Holloway, watched from my desk with the same calm patience that had carried me through months of humiliation, sipping my chipped Ohio State mug as if nothing had changed, while internally I cataloged every flicker of doubt, every tightened jaw, every nervous twitch, knowing that each one was proof that my plan was working. proof that the arrogance which had once seemed untouchable was finally beginning to crack. Rebecca, meanwhile, had started leaving more obvious traces of her hubris. Texts, photos, and messages meant to flaunt her victory with Jonathan, but inadvertently leaving a trail of evidence, timestamps, and patterns I had quietly archived over weeks, creating a meticulous record of betrayal, arrogance, and entitlement. And the realization that she herself had built the scaffolding for the coming collapse gave me a silent thrill that I sipped along with my coffee, the warmth grounding me in the quiet satisfaction of inevitability. That day, a client called the office, frustrated about an inconsistency in an account that Jonathan had personally approved, and as I pretended to offer assistance, forwarding relevant documentation to HR and finance, I watched him struggle to justify a decision he thought no one would question, his confident smirk dissolving into tight-lipped tension. A man suddenly aware that the safety net of arrogance he had relied on for years was woven from holes too large to conceal, and I realized the most devastating part of revenge is that it often arrives in subtle increments, almost imperceptible until the cumulative weight finally collapses under its own mass. At the same time, Rebecca's careless brags about weekend getaways and private lunches became the linchpin of a pattern I had been assembling. Her own words recorded and cross-referenced with financial statements, emails, and timestamps, forming a lattice of undeniable truth that would leave both of them exposed when the moment came, and I reminded myself, quietly savoring each step, that the beauty of revenge is not spectacle but inevitability. When all the pieces align, there is no room to deny what is plainly evident. Late that evening, I sat in my truck overlooking the city, thermos of coffee in hand, reflecting on how perfectly the pattern had taken shape, the way arrogance and entitlement create their own undoing. And I realized something important. People who betray you assume weakness will always be visible, that humiliation alone is enough to keep you in line. But when patience is wielded like a scalpel, every careless word, every smug gesture, every misstep becomes a tool for justice, and the calm, deliberate construction of consequence is far more satisfying than immediate retaliation. The chipped mug I had carried for years, once just a ritualistic comfort, now held symbolic weight, a reminder that small, overlooked elements often carry the sharpest edge, and I thought about how Rebecca had mocked it, never realizing that it would mark her first lesson in the consequences of her arrogance, the tangible object anchoring months of quiet, precise preparation. By midweek, Jonathan's facade was fraying visibly. Meetings that once required no preparation now left him fumbling with documents. HR and finance were asking pointed questions based on evidence I had quietly submitted, and I watched as the panic crept into his posture. A man realizing that control is a fragile illusion, and that the very person he had humiliated now held the keys to his unraveling. And I felt a quiet thrill in my chest, sipping coffee, letting the moment expand, knowing that every detail had been orchestrated with meticulous care, from minor misfiled reports to emails I had strategically sent to record his oversights, each one a silent hammer striking the foundation of his confidence. Rebecca, meanwhile, began to flinch in subtle ways, leaving the mug I had been watching on the counter just slightly askew, a small but symbolic gesture that her careless arrogance was finally meeting its match. And I reminded myself that poetic justice is sweetest when it arrives without warning, quietly, and tied to the very objects and rituals the betrayer once held in contempt. By the weekend, the dominoes were falling faster. Jonathan's mistakes were being questioned by clients and management alike. Rebecca's patterns of entitlement and flaunting were now documented in ways even HR could not ignore, and I, quietly observing, made minor nudges in emails and meetings, amplifying small cracks into significant fissures, each one pushing them closer to the inevitable collapse I had been orchestrating for months, all while keeping my own composure, sipping coffee, and noting the precision of cause and effect, the beauty of subtlety, and the symmetry of consequences aligned perfectly with months of observation and quiet patience. The air between them and the rest of the office had shifted. Whispers began, glances held longer than necessary, and suddenly the aura of invincibility they had relied upon was gone, replaced by scrutiny, uncertainty, and the first hints of real fear. And I knew the net was now fully set, the trap closed enough that even a single misstep would trigger the cascade I had anticipated. And I felt a strange mix of relief and exhilaration, knowing that the humiliation they had once forced upon me was about to return, multiplied, and framed in a way that left no doubt about who had been underestimated. Sitting at home that night, watching Rebecca fumble with details she thought were secure, her texts accidentally revealing more than she intended, and Jonathan nervously checking emails, I thought about how precisely the symbolic elements, the chipped mug, the coffee ritual, the overlooked receipts had woven through the entire operation. Subtle markers tying months of preparation to the first tangible consequences, and I realized with satisfaction that the elegance of revenge is in its quiet inevitability, the way it accumulates imperceptibly until the moment of impact arrives, and then the fallout seems both natural and devastatingly precise, leaving the betrayer exposed, humiliated, and irrevocably undone, while the architect of the plan remains calm, collected, and unassailable. The morning air felt heavier than usual, as if the city itself had sensed the tension that had been quietly building for months, and I, Mark Holloway, 38, Columbus, Ohio, sitting in my truck with a steaming thermos of black coffee in hand, felt a rare calm descend over me, knowing the storm I had patiently cultivated was about to break. Jonathan's phone buzzed with messages from HR, flagged and highlighted with evidence I had strategically submitted, forcing him into meetings where explanations faltered, and I watched the first real cracks in his composure as he struggled to navigate questions about expense reports, client approvals, and project discrepancies that I had meticulously documented, and for the first time, the man who had humiliated me publicly, who had flaunted his victory with a smug arrogance that assumed I was broken, looked genuinely uncertain. The smirk he had worn like armor stripped away by the quiet inevitability of precision and patience, while Rebecca, blissfully unaware that the threads she had left behind were being tugged with precision, strutted past my desk, phone in hand, posting photos from their weekend getaway, and leaving her signature boss lady mug on the counter in plain view. The very object she had once mocked now poised to become a symbol of the consequences of careless hubris. By mid-morning, whispers had started circulating through the office. Colleagues exchanged glances, subtly confirming suspicions that Jonathan's meticulous facade had fractures, and I remained outwardly calm, sipping coffee, cataloging each reaction, noting the ripple effect I had engineered over months of quiet observation, minor nudges, and carefully documented evidence, while internally savoring the way subtle preparation can magnify the smallest arrogance into undeniable exposure. That afternoon, the client whose account had first triggered the chain of events called directly to ask for clarification, and the email trail I had set up, carefully time-stamped, copied, and cross-referenced, left Jonathan fumbling, stammering, unable to provide a confident explanation, and I knew the first tangible blow had landed. The first public taste of the humiliation he had once imposed on me returning in a measured, bureaucratic, and irreversible form, a quiet devastation that was almost poetic in its inevitability. Meanwhile, Rebecca's texts, screenshots of lunches, and careless social posts were being collected, forming a clear pattern that linked her indulgence to Jonathan's professional missteps. A lattice of exposure that would soon leave both of them equally unmasked, and I sipped my coffee, the warmth a grounding reminder that patience and careful calculation have power far beyond immediate action. By evening, the office buzzed with a quiet tension. Jonathan's attempts to regain control were faltering, meetings dragging longer, explanations muddled, while Rebecca began to notice the subtle pressure, her once confident stride faltering slightly when she realized her social media posts and careless bragging were being pieced together by HR, and she left her boss lady mug carelessly on the counter, unaware that it had become an emblem of the small, symbolic details that now bound her hubris to consequence. And I reminded myself, sipping my coffee, that revenge is most effective when it is inevitable, when every thread of arrogance, every misstep, every careless gesture converges to leave the betrayer exposed. That night, I reviewed the complete dossier one last time. Emails, receipts, credit card statements, social media posts, and office communications, all cross-referenced and time-stamped, the architecture of justice assembled quietly over months, now ready to deliver the first real, undeniable blows. And I felt a deep, visceral satisfaction that comes only when months of patience, humiliation, and quiet observation finally intersect with the exposure of those who thought themselves untouchable. Late that night, I drove past the city lights, coffee in hand, thinking about the symbolism of the mug, the ritual I had maintained through weeks of planning, a small, overlooked object that would anchor the coming revelation, and I realized how potent subtle symbols can be, how they can take on meaning far beyond their original purpose, becoming instruments of poetic justice, tying personal arrogance to tangible consequence. And as I parked outside my apartment, I felt the surge of inevitability. The storm I had been building quietly for months was finally descending, precise, measured, and unstoppable. Jonathan would soon realize that every misstep he had taken, every oversight, every casual arrogance had been collected, catalogued, and weaponized in ways he could not anticipate, while Rebecca would discover that her carelessness, flaunting, and indulgence had left a trail that even the most confident facade could not obscure, and together, the two would feel the weight of their betrayal. The same weight I had carried in silence now returned tenfold. By the following morning, the first real public unraveling began. Jonathan was called into a meeting with HR and the finance team. Evidence of discrepancies laid before him, each document time-stamped and cross-referenced, and I watched from my desk, pretending to focus on emails as his posture shifted, eyes darting, voice tightening, fingers clenching, and I felt the quiet thrill of inevitability. The calculated satisfaction of seeing arrogance falter under the weight of meticulously documented truth. Rebecca, sensing the shift, tried to intervene, but the threads of evidence linked her directly to the pattern. Her social media posts, texts, and careless bragging now formalized as part of the narrative that exposed both of them. And I sipped my coffee, warm and grounding, noting how perfectly the symbolic elements, the chipped mug, the rituals of everyday life, the unnoticed habits had become instruments of poetic justice, tying months of humiliation, observation, and patient planning into a crescendo that neither of them could escape. By midday, the office was electric with the quiet shock of realization. Jonathan's confident smirk was gone, replaced with tight-lipped tension, while Rebecca's overconfidence had given way to visible anxiety, and I, calm and composed, watched the convergence of months of patient planning, small nudges, overlooked details, and symbolic reminders coalesce into a moment of undeniable reckoning, all anchored by the chipped coffee mug and the ritual of black coffee that had marked my own quiet preparation. A reminder that patience, observation, and meticulous attention to detail are often more powerful than rage, more effective than confrontation, and infinitely more satisfying when finally revealed. By mid-morning, the office had transformed into a stage for reckoning, and I, Mark Holloway, 38, Columbus, Ohio, sat at my desk with a calmness born of months of preparation, sipping coffee from my chipped Ohio State mug, watching the first waves of consequences ripple through Jonathan and Rebecca like a slow-motion avalanche. Jonathan had been called into an emergency meeting with HR, finance, and upper management, his carefully constructed narrative unraveling as every misstep I had documented over weeks, every misfiled approval, every overlooked expense, every casual overreach he had committed in arrogance, now lay before him in undeniable form, time-stamped, cross-referenced, and impossible to dismiss. And I felt a cold satisfaction as I observed the man who had once humiliated me publicly now faltering under the weight of his own hubris. A man realizing that control is an illusion and pride, a fragile, easily shattered veneer. Meanwhile, Rebecca had attempted to intercede, smug confidence masking unease, only to realize that her own carelessness had been collected into a precise pattern, her texts, photos, social media posts, and casual brags forming an irrefutable lattice of exposure, and for the first time, I saw the arrogance that had once seemed untouchable collapse in real time. Her eyes darting, fingers trembling as she realized that her victories were now evidence of her own undoing. The first twist arrived subtly, but with devastating clarity. A seemingly minor contract oversight I had nudged into play weeks ago, something Jonathan had brushed aside in overconfidence, became the legal lever that HR used to freeze part of his project approvals, creating a ripple that exposed further discrepancies, each one tied back to the emails, receipts, and reports I had quietly amassed. And suddenly, the veneer of control he had wielded so arrogantly was gone, replaced by panic, scrambling, and the first real recognition that he had underestimated the quiet patience of the man he thought was defeated. And I sat back in my chair, sipping coffee, letting the full weight of inevitability wash over me, knowing that every carefully planted domino was now actively toppling. Rebecca, meanwhile, found her own double twist. The boss lady mug, a symbol she had mocked and flaunted carelessly, now became part of a HR report that cited her repeated flaunting of company culture, personal indulgences, and social arrogance as a professional liability, a poetic irony that left her both publicly embarrassed and internally humiliated. And I couldn't help but note, sipping coffee and smiling faintly, how beautifully the symbolic threads I had woven through months of planning had come together to deliver a tangible, crushing blow. By afternoon, the second twist revealed itself with a clarity that felt almost cinematic. The evidence I had quietly preserved not only exposed individual missteps, but demonstrated a pattern of recklessness and entitlement that implicated Jonathan and Rebecca together, their arrogance now entwined in a way that left management no choice but to enforce serious consequences. Jonathan's project approvals were suspended, clients questioned his competency, and internal audits were launched, while Rebecca's hubris, captured in her own communications, made her appear reckless and unprofessional. The culmination of months of subtle observation, careful recording, and strategic nudges now delivering a professional and personal collapse that was both public and irreversible. And I watched it unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and grim acknowledgement that justice had finally arrived, precise, inevitable, and devastatingly thorough. That evening, I walked past the office lights, thermos of coffee in hand, reflecting on the subtlety of the architecture I had built. Months of quiet observation, minor nudges, bureaucratic leverage, and symbolic objects. The chipped mug, the casual coffee ritual, the overlooked receipts all converged, create a moment where arrogance met inevitability, hubris met consequence, and betrayal met poetic justice. And I realized that the most satisfying revenge is not rage-fueled but patience-fueled, measured, and unstoppable, the kind that allows the betrayer to believe they are still in control even as they step into the trap they themselves have constructed. Then came the final emotional twist, subtle yet shattering. Jonathan, desperate to salvage credibility, attempted a last-minute maneuver to shift blame, only to find that the email chain, meticulously preserved and time-stamped, left no room for denial. Every attempt at deflection was blocked by evidence so precise it forced him into public acknowledgement of error, humiliation, and exposure, while Rebecca, in a final act of overconfidence, posted a casual photo that inadvertently confirmed her direct involvement in the very patterns of recklessness I had documented, ensuring that both would face the consequences simultaneously, intertwined in accountability, the perfect symmetry of poetic justice. And I, sipping coffee, watched with a grim sense of satisfaction as the full weight of their arrogance and betrayal collapsed around them, inevitable, undeniable, and complete. By late evening, the office had quieted into a stunned hush. Jonathan's confidence had been shattered, Rebecca's smugness replaced with visible shame, and the symbolic elements, the chipped mug, the ritual of coffee, the minor yet telling receipts had anchored the entire operation in reality, a tangible manifestation of months of meticulous planning, careful patience, and quiet observation. And I realized that the elegance of revenge is not in spectacle but in the inevitability of consequence, the symmetry of hubris meeting justice, and the way small, overlooked details can amplify humiliation into an unforgettable reckoning, leaving the betrayer exposed, humiliated, and irrevocably undone, while the orchestrator remains calm, composed, and quietly triumphant. By the following morning, the air in the office was heavy with a mixture of disbelief, whispered speculation, and quiet awe. And I, Mark Holloway, 38, Columbus, Ohio, sat at my desk, sipping the familiar black coffee from my chipped Ohio State mug, feeling the calm after months of storm building as Jonathan, once the embodiment of smug confidence, shuffled papers nervously, his posture tight, eyes darting as he realized that every public misstep, every error, every casual arrogance he had displayed was now documented, cross-referenced, and undeniable. A lattice of exposure that left him completely cornered, while Rebecca, sitting nearby with a pale face and trembling hands, clutched her own boss lady mug in ironic contrast. The very object she had flaunted carelessly, now a symbol of her hubris and downfall. And I felt a quiet, almost meditative satisfaction, knowing that the culmination of months of patience, careful planning, and quiet observation had finally arrived, leaving them both exposed in a manner that was irrevocable, precise, and utterly poetic. The final blows fell like clockwork. HR confirmed internal audits, Client feedback highlighted the consequences of Jonathan's errors, and Rebecca's careless bragging, once invisible to those around her, had now been woven into an irrefutable narrative of entitlement and recklessness, leaving both of them with nowhere to hide. And the beauty of it lay in the subtlety, in the way months of tiny nudges, misfiled emails, strategic documentation, and symbolic markers, the chipped mug, the coffee ritual, receipts carefully preserved, had converged into a crescendo of consequences they had never imagined possible. And as I watched their disbelief crystallize into real, tangible reckoning, I thought about the philosophy I had quietly lived by. Arrogance always leaves fingerprints. Patience is sharper than rage, and the smallest details can carry the heaviest weight when wielded correctly. Later that afternoon, the office was silent save for the occasional click of keyboards and whispered questions, and I observed with detached satisfaction as Jonathan attempted, unsuccessfully, to regain composure in front of clients and colleagues, every sentence he spoke laden with hesitancy and doubt, while Rebecca, once full of smug confidence, avoided eye contact, her hands shaking slightly as she realized that the very patterns of carelessness she had ignored had now become instruments of public humiliation. And I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from watching justice unfold not through confrontation, but through inevitability, through patience, precision, and the careful orchestration of events over time. And I reminded myself again, revenge is an art of timing, preparation, and subtlety, and when executed correctly, it leaves no doubt in the mind of the betrayer about who underestimated whom. By evening, I walked past the office windows, thermos in hand, the city lights reflecting in the glass, and thought about the lessons of the past months. Betrayal hurts, arrogance blinds, and meticulous patience is a weapon sharper than any immediate act of retaliation. And I realized that the symbolic elements, the chipped mug, the ritual of black coffee, the overlooked receipts, had not only anchored my own focus through the months of planning, but now marked the tangible threads of poetic justice, tying the everyday habits and objects of life to a lesson in humility and consequence that Jonathan and Rebecca would never forget, while I remained outside the storm, calm, composed, and quietly victorious. That night, I returned home and placed the chipped mug on the counter, staring at it as I reflected on everything that had transpired. The months of humiliation I had endured, the patience I had maintained, the subtle observations, the careful collection of evidence, and the precise orchestration of consequences, and I felt the weight of scars earned, lessons learned, and wisdom gathered. A realization that while the process had been painstaking, the satisfaction of justice, inevitable and unassailable, was unlike anything else, and that life, much like revenge, rewards preparation, patience, and the careful attention to details most people overlook in their arrogance. As I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, the aroma grounding me in the reality of everyday life, I thought about the lines I had repeated to myself over these months. People reveal themselves in the smallest things. Arrogance leaves fingerprints, and patience is sharper than rage. And I knew with the quiet certainty of experience that they were more than just thoughts, they were lived truths. Philosophies written in the small details of observation, action, and eventual reckoning. Lessons etched into the fabric of life that no amount of public humiliation could ever erase from the betrayer once revealed. By the weekend, Jonathan had resigned under pressure. Clients lost confidence. HR had documented every pattern of oversight and carelessness, and Rebecca had been reassigned, her reputation marred by the very arrogance she had flaunted, both of them humbled and exposed in ways that were irreversible. While I sipped coffee, watching the city lights glimmer outside, feeling the quiet mix of satisfaction, scars, and closure. And I knew that the poetic justice, anchored by symbolic markers and careful attention to detail, had been delivered exactly as intended, and that life had finally balanced itself after months of humiliation, betrayal, and quiet orchestration. And in that quiet moment, alone with my thoughts and the lingering warmth of the coffee, I realized the most important truth of all. The people who betray you always underestimate your patience. They always ignore the weight of details they think are trivial, and the smallest, most overlooked elements, the chipped mug, the misfiled email, the casual receipt, can carry the heaviest consequences when combined with strategy, observation, and the quiet inevitability of justice. And as I took the last sip, I knew I had walked through betrayal, endured humiliation, orchestrated consequence, and emerged scarred, wiser, and victorious. The final echoes of arrogance and hubris collapsing behind me while I stepped forward, steady, composed, and quietly free. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.